All right, so now we're ready to go. All right, so this is going to be talking about focusing on projects that matter. And we're going to be talking about website governance. Maybe your team has felt like you've been stuck with endless site maintenance. I've been there, and hopefully you can learn from some of my experiences along the way, some of the things that didn't work out well and we learned from, but also the things that did work well. And hopefully the takeaway from this is that it's really easy to hear the word governance and maybe be a little bit afraid of that or be unsure about it. And hopefully after hearing this, you have a better idea of what website governance is and a path forward if you want to try and implement that where you're at. But before I jump into that, a real quick introduction of myself. I'm John Richards. I'm a developer advocate at Pantheon. And there I specialize on assisting teams in implementing best practices. Now, before I worked at Pantheon, I worked at Washington University in St. Louis for 7 years. And there I served in a lot of different roles, from web developer to senior director of digital communications. And across those roles, I've had a chance to get involved in many different stages of governance, and hopefully I can share that a little bit with you today. Now, a challenge when thinking about this is that governance is incredibly broad. The term covers a lot of different things, so I've structured it this way. Hopefully this will be helpful. We're going to start out by talking about the challenges that teams face as they start to work on a lot of websites. Then we'll talk a little bit about governance, introduce that, talk about what it is, and then we'll look at governance through the lens of 3 different perspectives. So different members that may be on your team, maybe your team's a little different, but hopefully this will give an idea of how governance looks from a website operations point of view. And then we'll look into this idea of communication. So you can have all this governance, but if people don't know about it, if it's not implemented and people aren't following it, then it doesn't do any good. So we'll talk about communication at the end, and then hopefully that will help you feel more prepared for your own website governance. So the challenge. How do you get out of an ever deepening hole of work? What do you do? So this really came about. I had started working at the university I was at, and caveat right here, I'm going to be talking, this specific example is from a university perspective. And so it may translate very easily if you're at a university. But I believe the concepts here actually translate across industries as long as you're working on large portfolios of sites, especially those that have a lot of similarities between them. And so having worked at Pantheon, I've seen this, we have clients in the pharmaceutical industries, we have clients in government, and lots of different sectors that still can gain value out of this because they have a lot of sites. And so once you reach a certain point, this is really good. Now you can have governance on a single site. You just aren't going to get the same amount of value you would get as if you were rolling this out across a lot of different sites. All right, there's my caveat out of the way. And so let's jump back into the story. We were flooded with a ton of requests. And our method of accepting website requests, we were kind of the central website department for the university, was to have a long list. And every time somebody else needed a website, we added it to the list. And then we just went through and picked them as they came along. And this was not a great way to work. We found out we were just falling further and further behind. Requests were coming in faster than we could do them. And it was very disheartening. We had a couple specific examples. We had a department come in and they said, hey, we need a new website. And we were like, okay, great. We'll get to it when we can. It took about a year before we were able to reach the point where we could work on this new website. Finally, a content strategist, a designer, and myself were assigned to work on this. It took us about 4 months to build them a brand new site with all the bells and whistles they were hoping for. But within 1 year, they had abandoned the website and went with a different solution. We looked at the analytics, and in that year time, only about 1,000 different views had hit that website. And so we had 3 people working on this website for 4 months just to get 1,000 views. It was a horrific waste of time and effort on our end. There were other problems as well, but just from a pure statistics standpoint, it was a very bad investment. We also had a campus store that decided they wanted an online shop. We never worked in e-commerce, but we're like, okay, we'll try this. But we were still stuck with our short timelines. And so a couple months into the project, we found out, oh, wait, they aren't using a normal payment system. They have a special university payment system. And this legacy system didn't work with any of the code we were using, the libraries that we had. We ended up hacking something together. My coworker eventually was able to buy a beer glass through the site, but there were still too many edge cases and it was not ready for production. Due to the long timeline, we couldn't stay on it. We had to move to the next project, so it was put on hold till the next time we could come back around, and we never did. Years later, we noticed the site had finally been tossed and built by an outside vendor instead, but it was still filled with bugs and problems. And so we realized there has to be a better way. And that leads us to this idea of governance. So first, let's talk about what it is. There are lots of different kinds of governance out there. So for this discussion, we're going to scope this specifically to the idea of website governance. So we're not going to be talking about other governance. There's governance in industries like HIPAA. There's technical governance. There's all kinds of this. And they can intersect. If you're working at a place, we would bump up against HIPAA as we worked with our medical school. And so you may need to get involved with those, but specifically for your websites, we're going to be just scoping this to you and kind of hopefully what the tech team works on. And so what is governance? If you're not familiar with it, or maybe you've heard it tossed around a lot and trying to figure out what it is, it is the human and technical systems, policies, and procedures to manage website operations. Kind of a mouthful, and maybe that still doesn't feel very meaningful. And so I think what resonates better is to think about the why of website governance. And so here, I think, is where hopefully you can start to see the value of this. What you're looking for is peace of mind. This should make it so that you don't go to bed at night worried about something breaking, something blowing up, something out there that shouldn't be. So that peace of mind that allows you to focus on other things. And then this is where the scale comes in. If you're doing this consistently at scale, it will increase productivity. So this peace of mind and productivity are hopefully what you get out of governance. If it's done well, you can. But there's always a worry that, oh, this isn't done well, and it will only create more red tape. And I think that's one of the bigger reasons people kind of push back against this. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later on. If you're too rigid, you can run into some problems. So I talked about that challenge we were in. How do we get out of it? And so our website governance began with a strong website strategy. Some new leadership came in, and they began working on a better way to handle just this mountain of requests that were coming in. And so for us, this involved centralized project governance, or centralized website governance, if you will. There were the website projects. And so there's a few different ways to do governance. There are some decentralized methods. There's a few different variations. We're going to talk about centralized here. That's what I have the most familiarity with. And when I say centralized governance here, that centralized means that there is a specific person or team that those requests go through. So in this case, a PIT team, as they call themselves, or the project intake team was formed, and they began to evaluate all the website requests that came in. And they created a three-pronged approach to measuring these websites. Now, this team actually only existed for a few years and eventually was phased out. And the reason it was phased out was once this team had sorted these for long enough, it suddenly became real apparent to everyone when a request came in where that request fell. And there no longer was a need for a team to evaluate this. And I think that can be a nice value, is once a team kind of forms and begins to sort out these kinds of questions, that muscle memory can stay, and then you can actually speed up the process by everybody just having very clear guidelines. But when you start out, sometimes you don't have those written very well, and you can kind of have a team evaluate and then codify that approach. So this approach was this three-pronged here. There were the strategic sites. So we still wanted to build out new websites. We still wanted to innovate. We still wanted to do this, and we needed to, but we decided to only do that for the most impactful websites. We didn't want to work on sites where we were stuck with 1,000 views for months and months of work. And so these sites would go in here. As I said, our flagship site, university news, magazine, and then really important initiatives to the university would still fall in this process of dedicated time and effort to build this out. The other place that we then began to look at was how can we service a lot of people? This here bucket approach is a much more, this is the matured version that came along years later when we began. We weren't quite this ambitious with where these would be, but eventually this idea of one key theme to rule them all that would be used morphed into a self-service environment. But the idea here was a shared code base, at least mostly so, that could be used across many different websites. Now, when we started out, we had hoped to get, I can't remember if the number was 7 or 12 sites into this, and that was going to be success. When we first evaluated, by the time I left the university, there were over 2,000 websites in this. So it scaled out far beyond what we had anticipated. And then I'm going to talk here real quick about this middle option, which was outsourced sites. And so we knew there were things that fell in between and in the cracks here, if you will, and we wanted to make sure those still were addressed. This was things like our police website that needed certain critical functionality. We wanted to make sure that they had maybe groups that have large grants or specific needs. They still weren't impactful enough that we wanted to focus on them, but we also knew they weren't just run of the mill. And so we formed a relationship with some really great vendors in the area and began to work with them to provide this kind of middle ground where if there was funding, either we could help contribute to, or the group themselves had funding, they could use this outsourced effort to get something special. And this worked really well for us. Now we're going to jump in to a little more specifically around a lot of this like self-service area, or at least shared theme area. But you can kind of dig deep into each of these if you wanted, but we're going to focus on this area for this. So as we think about this, I mentioned already, governance can get a bad rap for being a whole lot of red tape or making it so that you can't do things. And so what you want, and it can feel a little bit like an oxymoron, but is governance with flexibility. And the idea here is you want these rules, these restrictions, but if you go out and just wholesale copy somebody else's, and it might work great for them, it's probably not going to work well for you. And so you want to be intentional about the choices you're making and crafting this to what you're doing, following best practices, of course, but being aware of why you're making choices. And so architecture is an important part of building this out. And so I kind of wanted to leave you with some questions to map out and figure out what works well for you. So one of the first questions you're going to want to ask yourself is this code shared? So as you're looking at this, what code across the websites do you want to share? We ended up wanting to share the theme. A lot of the core code, like 90% was going to be the same. And so that mattered for us, but maybe that's a different amount for you. Think about what resources are shared. We had some websites that fit really well in this shared code spot, but they had critical infrastructure. They need to be up. And so, for instance, our emergency website, it didn't need to look amazing. They didn't need something flashy, but it needed to be up no matter what. And so it could not live in a shared environment. And so even though it fit every other use case, the fact that it needed dedicated resources meant we treated it as a special use case rather than putting it in here. But think about what resources are shared from a server perspective. And then what access are you going to need, site owners are going to need? This can impact how you structure this out. Are they going to need any access to to the architecture to add their own code, and how might that impact other sites. And so thinking about that's really important. And then think about who owns this piece of the puzzle. It's really important that you don't only build and have a great environment, but that it continues to be maintained. In our case, we ended up handing this off to the IT department, and they kind of ran with this, owned it, maintained it, did a great job. And so, and then our team, the marketing team at the time, handled the rest of the sites. So just be thinking about this process and knowing that this is an ongoing discussion that needs to happen. So that's a little caveat about architecture here before we jump into the website operations team that you're going to have. What we were using was a three-legged stool approach. And so we had the coding team, we had designers, and then we had content strategists. So as we look at website governance, I'm going to highlight it from these three areas and hopefully show how it impacted all of us as we work through here. And again, back to our why, we were doing this because we wanted to bring peace of mind to all three of these teams. We were all feeling very overwhelmed. And then we also wanted us all to have increased productivity as we thought about these challenges at scale, instead of thinking about them as one-off challenges. So let's start here with code. Performance is absolutely critical. We cared about performance before this, but whenever you start rolling out a change and it's going to impact not 1 or 2 or 5 sites, but 100 or 1,000 websites, performance changes really scale up quick and can have big ramifications, both good and bad. If you can increase performance even a little bit, you've done that for every website across your environment, which is a huge. And conversely, if you suddenly add in code that's not optimized and is a bit slow, if that's going to be running on all of your websites, you can take down the server, which I absolutely have done before. And so, hey, let's not do this again. And so this idea of performance starts to come out. And so we began to measure our performance, to have metrics. There isn't a, hey, here's the metric you need to hit, like hit this number and you're solid. It's just important that you're thinking about these metrics, that you're looking at them so you can understand, like, hey, this is code that's acceptable and we can push this out, or no, this is too big an impact, we're not going to allow it, work on this more. So having coding standards around this is really important. Another key area is accessibility. We wanted our users to value accessibility, and we realized quickly that if you tell people, hey, this needs to be accessible, and they go in and are like, oh, okay, let me run a little bit of accessibility testing, and then the core underlying code isn't accessible, they're going to come back and let you know really quickly. And so making sure that this was accessible was really important. Keyboard access, screen readers, we were testing. A big challenge often is around menus, so making sure that your menu works well. And just, pick a guideline out there. We started with WCAG 2.0 AA. It's kind of the standard. 2.1 is out now. And so you probably aren't going to be perfect when you start, or you definitely won't be, but pick a guideline, start working towards it, and have a goal in mind. So yeah, do accessibility. It's the right thing to do. And then the other area was around code reviews. It really is crazy out there. If you are looking at code, this can be, maybe you're grabbing a module, maybe you're grabbing copying code from somewhere, maybe it's a library that you're using, but you really want to make sure, and then of course, your own written code and other developers on the team, it's important to be reviewing that. Performance, again, is important, but so is security. If you're using contributed code, it's really important to look at the activity and what will this code be maintained for a while, or is this a library that might get decommissioned and you'll have to migrate later? Because migrating one site's a challenge, migrating 100 sites, a whole nother level of complexity. Looking at some kind of coding standards, probably, if it's not your own code, you can't expect everybody to code to your coding standards, but at least make sure they're following some. And then make sure you're not duplicating things. You don't want to end up with like 2 different two different kinds of events solutions or something like that, the more you can solidify on a single way to do things, it will save you so much time down the road. And then there's deployment. It's really important to focus on this. So I've got a kind of a separate slide here, and again with some questions to think about. Where do you test? If you've got a lot of websites and you're rolling out changes, it will impact all of those. So having something break across 1,000 sites is terrible. So how do you test this ahead of time? Because it's usually not feasible to test 1,000 sites manually. So think about this. Do you have a dedicated environment where you can test these changes? And then what are you testing? We ended up using kind of a canary in the coal mine approach, which was the idea of identifying key sites in our portfolio that stretched the capabilities or represented really broad use cases. So we found a few of those that we would always test. And then we also picked like our top 5 most trafficked websites and shared those out. Or tested those to make sure that they were working. So figure out what you want to test. The other thing is, when do you deploy releases? This is really important to get in some kind of cadence so people have expectations. So be thinking about how often do changes come out? Do they go out as soon as they're ready? Or do you have some kind of release cycle? And then what kind of post-processing steps are you going to use? Does your development team need to come together on Grunt or Gulp, or are you using Composer? What are those steps that you want to use for your post processing so everybody's on the same page? And then let's see here. Oh, the Git is just a huge thing. Highly recommend using Git Flow or something like that for your process here. But how do you manage features in your branches to make sure that as lots of people work across this, all of their code can eventually be merged together and collaborate? So think about these questions as you think about that deployment plan, because they will save you a lot of time in the long run. Now, here is my a big caveat. I am a developer, so I'm going to be speaking about design here. This is what I've learned from working with designers. Make friends with your designers. Like, that's just a great thing to do. And so from a design perspective here, one of the areas that was really important was it allowed us to really bring about a lot of brand consistency through brand fonts, colors, things like that. We had designated space at the top, like a banner that was for the university. And so there was this consistent look and feel. They could, control a lot of the stuff in between, but there was some consistency across these websites. At first, people balked at this. It was like, I don't want my site to look like everybody else's website. But then people began to understand the value of brand over time. And then we started having people out there with their own design teams, building their own websites that would come to us and say, hey, can we get your styles? Can we get your style sheets? Things like this, so we can build ours to look like that. It was a huge win bringing people into this look and feel, because we were decentralized. We couldn't mandate everybody go look like this, but by building this across so many sites, people began to say, oh no, I want to look like the university, and began adopting it themselves beyond just the people inside of our shared environment. I know, back to accessibility, we'll keep harping on this, but this is really important, and it's really helpful to that. Like, hey, how do you get that productivity boost? For instance, we had found out partway through that our links, our hyperlinks, the brand red for those didn't meet the proper contrast ratios, and we needed to change that across the board. Well, with one change, we were able to change that on 90-some% of our sites, which was awesome. The other 10%, unfortunately, were not in this. And then we had to spend, just as long for those few sites, because we had to do them as one-off. So you can get a lot of value here and be able to roll this out. And then we ran into, when people first started using this, they didn't know what to do. And some really terrible looking sites came out of this that we would look at and be like, oh no, how do we solve this? And what we did is we realized people often didn't know what success should look like. And so we began trying to show them what the platform was capable of. This involved creating our own custom examples, and then also highlighting the wins. So people who were doing well, we made sure to highlight those. From a content perspective, again, I'm not a content person. make friends with your content people. They're awesome. And so they were able to use this environment to help with our writing style guidelines. So we had a style sheet or a writing style that we shared out and began to provide resources to everybody who was using this to say, hey, here's how you can sound more like the university. We used tools to monitor some accessibility, things like that. Because from a content standpoint, we really wanted to give our content creators freedom. That was part of our goal. And so we couldn't, we weren't writing it for them. And so that meant finding tools. We ended up using Site Improve to monitor it. We could send reports that said, hey, here is how your site is doing currently on accessibility. And people could go in and fix those issues as they came up. And then it's really important to have some kind of tracking and reports on this. And so you want to think about adding analytics across all of your sites. Maybe you're using this via Google Tag Manager, something like that. But figuring out a way to get data in so you can share and let people know, hey, here's how many people are using our site. Here's what they're doing with it. It's important for you to know how to improve it, but also really important when you need to justify, hey, here's why we're spending this much money on this system. Look at how many people are using it and what it's doing. So that brings us to this area of communication. So communication, really important here because you've got all this wonderful guidelines now that hopefully you've put together. You've thought about this governance. You've got this model. How do people find out about this? And so this is where we realized we had to start investing in this to make sure that it happened. So one of those things was around service level agreements, having some kind of SLA about how quickly you'll respond when people needed help. We had a dedicated person who ended up coming on to provide support and trainings to make sure people were educated and knew how to use the product. As they came on, they could come into these training classes. It was really cool seeing user groups form as lots of different departments started using this that kind of informally began talking amongst themselves. And eventually out of that even grew an accessibility user group that was championed. They brought in speakers, things like that. And so it was really awesome and an unexpected thing to see people sharing information amongst themselves. So like you'll be surprised both in terrible ways at what people will do with what you get when you give them tools, but also in wonderful ways as they create things that you didn't expect. And then be thinking about change management. Back to that idea of like release dates. It can be easy to roll out things as they're ready, but if you want your users to feel like they know what's going on. So you'll want some kind of change management process for either large migrations or when updates and things are coming. And so a cadence can really help with that to be able to say, hey, here's what's going to be coming out next month. Or here are the fixes that came out, and kind of engaging people, letting them know resources that are available. And so change management, an important part of the process of having people feel comfortable with your website governance. So I know we ran through a lot there, but we'll just do a quick recap here. From the code perspective, you're going to want to plan well and realize that any changes you make affects everything. And so that's why the planning is important. Design, expect the unexpected. People are going to use this stuff. Well, I guess I just said it in ways you don't expect. And so roll with it and figure out how to do that. With content, you're really looking at consistency here. And then you want to make sure people know about what governance you do have so that they can follow it. People, some people will try to buck the system, but most people are down to follow it if you can explain why and show them the process. And so it's important to have that communication piece there. So I kind of want to leave you with this. If you're thinking about this, if you are in a situation where you're like, hey, there's a lot of sites, I just want to encourage you to start doing it. Start that process of website governance. It was terrible how we got into it. We had planned for 12 sites. Our first solution was not super great. We had to go through a lot of different migrations. We made mistakes along the way, but we would not have got there if we hadn't started. So iterate on what works, jump in, try it, and I think you'll find benefit out of that and be better for it. So here's my contact information. If you want to follow up, you can find me as Jay Rostaban on Twitter, or check follow on, or yeah, check me out on LinkedIn. Otherwise, we could jump over. I will see if there are any questions here as we look to wrap things up. Let's see here. I don't see any at the moment, but if you want to post something in the Q&A or the chat, I'll be checking both of those. Thank you all. I appreciate Aaron there calling out, and Jimmy as well, but the relating, glad to hear, well, not glad to hear that you've had some of the same challenges, but hopefully you've been able to use some of these things to also find some success there. We'll ask it about need to iterate because you made mistakes. What kind of mistakes? I hinted at one of these. So I mentioned like, hey, whenever you use a library, you should check about activity. Is it maintained? We started using a library that we thought looked great. It met our like performance needs and kind of all of our review, but it was very new. And so we started using it, and within a few months, the maintainer said, hey, I can't do this anymore, and phased it out. Now, the library was still there, but what happened was we ended up running into some accessibility issues, so we contributed them back, but it wasn't maintained, so they weren't accepted. So we now had a custom fork of this library. And so we ended up being like, oh, we should start, like valuing more things that have been around for a while and have a consistent schedule and that we suspect will be around for much longer over maybe some of our other priorities. And so that suddenly became more important. And then of course, migrating away from that to a new option was then a challenge for us that took, months of work to get everything moved over. Thanks, John. I did mention I'm sure you all caught it, but yeah, we tried to accessibility in there at every one of those stages because we really did find out that we couldn't focus on it on just one. Because it was so broad, and then that started to come through with like as I mentioned, people forming an accessibility user group, and so we were glad that like, hey, people when they saw that we valued it, started educating around it, they started to value it, and kind of internally started to work on building their doing better at alt tags and things like that we couldn't control. So that was really cool to see. Oh, some good questions here. How do we handle custom code versus central updates? So I'm trying to think here on what you're referring to as central updates. Are you talking about like core updates? So assuming that's the case, we ended up using like Git what was it, submodules, I think, to handle like custom code as a way to pull that in on some of the things. I don't know that was the best way, but at the time that worked. And now there's kind of like, hey, here's the code to run complex submodule to roll this out for the custom code to kind of graft that in. Looking back, maybe we would have done it differently. There's some, I think, maybe more elegant ways to do that. But yes, how do you take a core code and bring in bits and pieces where you need it can be a challenge for sure. Did we get pushback from stakeholders for that special case versus high profile sites approach? Yes. And but it was helpful that like we had enough buy-in from kind of the core university leadership that we were still able to move forward. I think a lot of times what that became was then a discussion of, okay, well, do if this was the case, like you would have to be this far back in the queue Um, and so there was some discussion around that. Another place was that when we first started out, there were a lot of places that were like, we don't want to be a part of this broad use case, and so we only had a few schools adopt this when we launched. I think there was like 3 of our 7 schools, but within a few years, all the schools had come on board. Once they started seeing the value of getting this information out, that they could, easily, like, mechanically, there was nothing stopping them. We just said, if you don't want this, we won't allow you, people with from your school to use it. And but that ended up changing. We started building reports so they could get information, and so we started to kind of say, hey, well, if you have pushback, what's the reason around this? And we started to learn, well, they wanted more insight into the process. They wanted to know what was going on. And what we often saw was that people felt that this would need a lot more oversight, and so they would start out by saying, I need to know everything going on, and then I'm going to review these, and really quickly found out, like, oh, most people aren't going to be a problem, and like, this is a whole lot of work. Why don't I just let people use it, and we'll deal with it if something comes up? And so that ended up being how we landed. Kate asking about what external accessibility monitoring tools we used. I mentioned a little bit about Siteimprove, which was really handy as a way to manage that. We also used browser extensions like the Wave tool, things like that, to individually monitor. So we would at the accessibility user group, we had external speakers come in, or we would speak once in a while on specific topics. And so through there, we were able to educate people on which tools they could use, and also ways like, hey, have you looked at, some of the free screen readers out there if you want to try this? But for large scale like applications, it was Siteimprove mainly that we used. We did eventually adopt a search tool called Funnelback that searched our content and had some accessibility monitoring within it. And we were trying to debate, like, could we use that as an alternative to Siteimprove? But at the time, I know they're still working on things. At the time, it was not full featured enough to justify stepping away. Plus, Siteimprove had a couple other values from it as well. Oh, awesome. Looks like Jamie talking about some of the same things. They've started using Siteimprove, and they used Wave as well. So, yeah. Oh, and Funnelback. All right. That's awesome. Aaron here calling out, anytime they've used Git submodules, they've ended up with a headache. I agree completely. Talking about using a package management solution, yeah, that would be a much better way to have handled this. And so, yeah, talking about using Packagist and sharing your code publicly. Yeah, Aaron, thanks for calling that out, because I think that was something we never got to, sharing publicly. Something that we always aspired to, but it was always like, well, here's this reason or that. But I do think that, publicly and then using a package management solution would be the way to do this if I went back and tried to do it now. Christian asking, has the whole infrastructure moved to Kubernetes? No, it has not. I'm at Pantheon now, and that was because as part of this, it was like, hey, we need to go find some cloud infrastructure. Our stuff is becoming legacy. That ended up moving slowly, but along the way, I really liked a model that Pantheon had for this, and that ended up some conversations. We ended up as a university, they are still using an on-prem solution. Part of COVID came along as they were exploring and just ended that. But I was like, hey, actually, I really like this part of it, and I moved to Pantheon. But Christian, you're on the right track there. Like there's a better way if you're doing infrastructure. There's some what we had worked when we started 7 years ago, but now infrastructure has progressed so much. There's a lot of better ways to kind of build that out. Yeah, some other people offering insight, use extra care if you're using Git submodules. So yes, indeed. Especially now, Drupal 9, just embrace Composer, let that handle all of your stuff for you. much better way to handle this. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Thanks for the questions. And look forward to seeing you around at DrupalCon.